Late at night, Mrs. Mary sat in a comfortable chair by the window, the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the thin curtains, just enough for her to see her own reflection on the glass. In the quiet room, the television played softly, not because she cared about the breaking news out there, but because this was the only moment of the day when she could truly relax, when she did not have to worry about cooking, cleaning, or answering the meaningless questions from others in the house. It was the private time she had protected for 30 years, a quiet half-century of routine and solitude. But at that very moment, everything shattered like a storm breaking loose when Adam, her son-in-law, walked into the living room. She did not even notice him until the television suddenly went silent, the sharp click of the remote sounding like an alarm. The room fell into a sudden silence, a silence she could feel in every cell of her body, as if the air had been pulled out of the space. Adam stood there, staring at her with a cold, unblinking gaze. In that instant, she realized something had changed. "Get out, old woman," he said clearly, without hesitation, his face completely expressionless. The words felt like a cold wind, emotionless and sharp. Mrs. Mary remained seated, unable to believe what she had just heard. Each word from Adam struck her chest like a blow, tightening around her heart. It was pain, humiliation, and at the same time a moment of undeniable awakening. A few seconds later, Mrs. Mary turned toward Rachel, her daughter, who stood in the kitchen doorway holding 2 grocery bags, her eyes filled with visible anxiety. Mary waited for a sentence that would defend her, a simple statement such as, "Mom, this is your house," or at least a reminder telling Adam not to be so rude. But Rachel lowered her head, unable to meet her mother's eyes, and said nothing. The silence was deeply painful. Another kind of silence began to settle over Mrs. Mary, not the quiet of peace, but the numb stillness of betrayal slowly spreading through her. The daughter she had spent her entire life raising could not even stand up to protect her own mother. In that moment, something inside Mary died, not because of Adam's cruelty, but because of Rachel's indifference. Adam no longer bothered to acknowledge her presence. He simply turned his back, dropped heavily onto the sofa, turned on music from his phone, and behaved as if she did not exist at all. In his eyes, she was nothing more than an old, useless object. The feeling became painfully clear to her. She was not just unwanted in this house. She had become like a ghost. A deep loneliness surrounded her. She slowly stood up, ignoring the cracking sound of her aging joints. Her legs were tired, yet filled with quiet determination. She walked toward the door, her trembling hand holding the key, the cold metal pressed into her palm. Nothing about the house was unfamiliar. She had lived here her whole life. Every object carried a memory. Every corner held a story, but not anymore. She looked around one last time and felt how everything had changed. "Don't forget your glasses," Adam called after her with a mocking tone. Mrs. Mary did not respond. She simply stepped outside and gently closed the door behind her. The sound of the door shutting was not loud, yet it marked an ending. Not the end of her life, but the end of a chapter. Not out of anger or fear, but because she finally understood that the power had always been in her hands. Outside, she took a long breath, feeling the cool night air filling her lungs. The faint scent of flowers and the moisture of evening dew resting on the leaves made the night feel strangely fresh. She walked a short distance before calling a taxi to take her to a nearby hotel. As the car began to move, she realized that even if she was no longer treated as the owner of that house, she was still the owner of her own life. At the hotel, she did not rush to rest. Loneliness did not make her weak. She opened her old leather bag and took out a stack of documents from her earlier years of work. Those papers might have been forgotten by others, but to her, they were proof of her ownership of the house. Every word, every line clearly stated that the property belonged to her. She was no longer the fragile old woman Adam believed her to be. She was a woman who had worked in the legal field for 30 years, a woman who understood exactly what rights meant and how to reclaim what rightfully belonged to her. For the first time that day, she smiled. The house might have been taken over, but her ownership still existed. And tomorrow, Adam would understand that very clearly. Mary stood in the living room of the hotel, feeling how much smaller the space was compared to the large house she had lived in for decades. Her footsteps were gentle, yet they could not hide the determination rising inside her. All her life, she had lived to please others, to meet endless demands from her daughter, her son-in-law, and everyone else in the family. But last night, when Adam ordered her to leave, she realized she could not continue living that way anymore. She was exhausted from sacrifices that were never returned. She sat down on the single bed where the dim yellow light from the bedside lamp fell across her aged face. The feeling was strange, yet also comforting. Not because she was happy or satisfied with what had happened, but because for the first time in many years, she felt she could breathe. She looked out the window as the night slowly settled in. The city was still moving, yet for her everything seemed to pause, quiet in a strangely peaceful way. She picked up her old phone and searched for the number of Daniel Price, an old friend, someone who understood her work and knew well what she had been through. Daniel worked in the legal field, and she knew that only he could help her resolve this matter properly and lawfully. When the phone began to ring, she felt a slight hesitation. This was the first time she had called Daniel in many years. However, she did not have time to worry about the past. She needed help immediately. Margaret, Daniel's voice came through, slightly surprised but also concerned. Is everything all right? What's going on? For now it is, Mary said softly. But I need your help. Tomorrow I want to take my house back. A brief silence filled the conversation. Daniel had probably already guessed how serious the situation was. Mary continued, with nothing left to hide. Adam told me to leave. He said the house belongs to him. I do not want to create conflict, but I need to reclaim what is mine. Daniel took a slow breath before replying. The house still belongs to you, doesn't it, Margaret? Yes, I am the sole owner, Mary confirmed, feeling a growing sense of confidence filling her chest. Then we do not need anyone's permission. We just need to follow the proper procedure, Daniel said. They are not tenants. They are simply people staying there. And you have every right to ask them to leave. We will prepare an official notice. Daniel's words felt like a calming medicine to Mary. She sensed clarity in her decision, as if everything had suddenly become clear. She was no longer the silent woman who endured everything. The power was now in her own hands. That night, Mary could not sleep. The loneliness did not trouble her. Instead, it kept her alert. Thoughts kept passing through her mind. The image of Adam standing there, cold and rude, made her feel not only insulted, but also underestimated. Yet, she could not deny that the insult had awakened a part of her that had long been asleep. It was a part she had hidden for many years, a part filled with strength and determination. She picked up her old leather bag and opened it, pulling out documents from the days when she worked in the land and property sector. Those papers had not changed. They still held their full value. She smiled when she saw her name on the ownership certificates. Everything still belonged to her, even though for years she had lived in silence and sacrifice. She had forgotten that she was the true owner of that house. Not Adam, not Rachel, but her. She decided that the next morning she would begin the next steps. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she had realized that she had the right to demand respect. She had spent her entire life trying to please others, but now she finally knew what she had to do. When dawn arrived, Mary felt as if she had been reborn, not because of what she was about to do, but because she had finally recognized her own worth. There was no longer any fear or worry about what others might think. She had decided to take back control of her life and begin a journey she had never dared to imagine before. She looked out the window, where the warm golden sunlight poured into the room. A new day had begun, and Mary, a woman who would no longer be underestimated, would never return to the life she once lived. The next morning, Mary woke up early, even before the sunlight had a chance to warm the quiet space of the hotel room. A new feeling surrounded her, not because she had slept well, but because of something deeper. She had finally taken control of herself, and that feeling was stronger than any moment she had experienced in many years. For so long, she had buried her emotions, endured everything in silence, sacrificed nearly everything just to maintain a fragile and artificial harmony within the family. But now everything had changed. The sense of freedom, even though it had only just begun, made her feel like a completely new person. She opened her leather bag, the one that held her most valuable documents, the house ownership papers, the files from her former work, everything remained exactly as it had been when she was still working at the land office. To her, they were not just documents, they were proof of a power she had forgotten she possessed. During 30 years of work, she had learned that what was written on paper carried permanence. Emotions could change, people could change, but written records did not. And now Mary had everything she needed to reclaim both her house and the respect she deserved. She picked up her phone, took a deep breath, and dialed Daniel's number. An old friend, someone who had once watched her work tirelessly to maintain her life, to raise her child, and to protect that very house. Daniel's voice came through after a few rings, sounding slightly surprised but full of concern. "Margaret, how are things? Are you all right?" Mary paused for a moment, thinking carefully before answering. This time she was no longer the tired and fragile woman she had been before. She had already made her decision. "I am all right, and I need your help right now. I want them to leave, Daniel. I want the house to be mine again." This time there was no surprise or worry in Daniel's voice. He understood Mary's character well. She never asked for something unless she was completely certain. "Are you sure?" "You know this will not be an easy battle." "No, it will not be easy at all. But I no longer have another choice, Daniel. I will not allow them to continue invading my life." Daniel remained silent for a moment, as if carefully considering her words. Finally, he spoke again, his voice calm but decisive. "Then we will begin immediately. You have the right. They are not tenants. They are simply staying there. The procedure is straightforward. I will send them a formal notice to leave. No drama, no noise, just paperwork." "Thank you, Daniel. Tomorrow I will begin everything," Mary said, feeling a strong sense of certainty spreading through her. After hanging up, she sat quietly on the bed and looked out the window, where the first light of morning had begun to slip through the narrow gap in the curtains. The feeling of freedom slowly started filling her heart. She was no longer only a mother who constantly sacrificed herself, no longer someone who always stood on the sidelines, caring for everyone else. She had decided that she would now live for herself, for the life she had neglected for so many years. Her thoughts drifted back to the years when Rachel was still a little girl, when she had worked endlessly on her own to raise her child and build a home. She had never had time for herself. Everything revolved around the family, around the needs of her husband and her child. She had always stayed in the background, hoping only that everything would remain peaceful and that everyone else would be happy. But now she realized something she had ignored for too long. She also deserved respect. She had the right to live in the house she had worked so hard to build. Yet, one important question still echoed quietly in her mind. Would Rachel stand by her side? Would her daughter understand why she had to do this? For years, she had done everything for the family. But could she truly keep peace if her daughter found herself caught between two difficult choices? A trace of worry began to creep into her thoughts, but she refused to let it linger. This was the moment she had to remain strong and courageous. If there was one lesson she had learned throughout her life, it was that a person must know how to protect their own rights and never allow others to decide their life for them. The next day, Mary began taking the next steps. She went to Daniel's office, where he had already prepared the necessary legal documents. Every step she took was filled with determination. There was no hesitation, no fear, only certainty and strength. She signed the papers and sent the official notice to Adam and Rachel, giving them 30 days to leave the house. Her actions carried no doubt and no hesitation. She was no longer the woman others underestimated. She was a woman who possessed power, and she was ready to reclaim everything that rightfully belonged to her. Mary sat in the hotel's living area as the early morning light streamed through the window, illuminating her aging face, a face marked by time, yet filled with quiet determination. A sense of calm filled the room, but beneath that calm was a stillness charged with anticipation. Everything had already been prepared, yet she could not completely ignore the tension running through her body. Yesterday, she had signed all the necessary documents and sent the formal notice requiring Adam and Rachel to leave the house. Today, she needed to take the next steps to ensure that everything would unfold exactly as planned. The sense of freedom she had discovered over the past few days, ever since leaving the house, now felt clearer than ever. Yet she also understood that freedom was never easy. It always came with difficult choices, and she had already faced those choices. Adam, her son-in-law, would certainly not accept this change quietly. He would resist, he would try to complicate everything, but she was no longer afraid. The decision had already been made, and nothing could change that now. Her mind returned to the moment when Adam first ordered her to leave. His rude words, the cold expression in his eyes that did not even try to hide his contempt, had made her feel as if she no longer existed inside the very house she had spent a lifetime building. Yet what hurt her even more was Rachel's silence. Her daughter had not stepped forward to defend her mother. That silence forced her to confront a painful truth. For so long she had been too gentle, too willing to sacrifice, and she had forgotten about her own rights. Last night, as she lay on the narrow hotel bed, Mary had spent hours thinking. Memories of the years she spent caring for her child and building a family kept returning to her mind. She had done everything to protect her family, to keep life stable and peaceful. But now she understood that she also needed to protect herself. That house belonged to her, not to Adam, not to Rachel, and no one had the right to violate her ownership. A powerful sense of determination rose inside her. She could no longer continue living in silent endurance. This was the moment for her to reclaim her power, to stand up and defend what rightfully belonged to her. Yet she also knew that to do this, she had to be stronger than she had ever been before. That morning, she received a call from Daniel. His voice was calm, confident, and friendly, as if he already knew that everything was proceeding exactly as planned. "Margaret, the notice has been delivered, and they will receive it today. But I want you to prepare yourself. Adam is not someone who accepts the truth easily," Daniel said. His tone remained steady, but it was clear that he had already considered every possible situation. Mary nodded, even though he could not see her. "I am ready, Daniel. We will not step back." A brief silence filled the conversation. Then Daniel continued speaking. "You know everything will follow the proper procedure. There is nothing to worry about. Just be patient and let the law do its work." "That is right," Mary replied softly, yet her voice carried firm determination. "Thank you for helping me." After ending the call, Mary remained seated in the chair and let out a slow breath. The feeling of worry had not completely disappeared, but she knew this was the right step. She had devoted her entire life to her family, yet only now did she realize that family must also understand and respect her. No one had the right to invade her life. That was something she would defend at any cost. The day passed slowly, but Mary remained calm. She did not leave the hotel. She simply waited. As night arrived, she returned to her thoughts, determined not to allow anything to shake her belief. She could no longer live forever in silence and sacrifice. It was finally time for her to live for herself. Late that evening, she received a message from Daniel, informing her that his representative had gone to her house and officially delivered the notice to Adam. A sudden sense of relief rose quietly within her. Yet she knew this was only the beginning. The story was not over, and there would certainly be more challenges ahead. She looked at the small mirror in the room and suddenly realized she was no longer the exhausted and anxious woman she once had been. Her silver hair carried the mark of time, but her eyes shone brightly with determination. That strength felt new, yet deeply real, making her feel like a warrior ready to face an unforgiving battle. This was her battle, and this time she would not step back. Throughout the entire day, Mary felt time moving slowly, as if every minute stretched longer than usual, yet it was filled with expectation. Even though the decision had already been made and the next steps were clear, she still could not completely shake the tension inside her. Yesterday, when Daniel called to inform her that the notice had been sent and that Adam would receive it today, she felt as if a heavy burden had finally been lifted from her shoulders. Yet she knew that this was only the beginning, and the real battle had only just started. She could not forget the way Adam had looked at her the night before, the cold and contemptuous gaze, the harsh tone of his voice ordering her to leave the living room of her own home. Mary sat in the armchair, gazing out through the hotel window, where the weak light of the late afternoon sun was slowly fading. The quiet atmosphere of the room made it easier for her to think. Over the past few days, she had often asked herself whether what she was doing was truly the right thing. Could her determination really break through the barriers Adam had built over so many years? She could not answer that question immediately, but she knew one thing with certainty: she had endured enough. She had buried herself in endless sacrifices, in silent endurance, in the constant disrespect and belittlement from her son-in-law, but now things were different. She had finally decided that she deserved a life that was not controlled by anyone else. Memories of the difficult years she had spent working in the land management field came back to her mind. The tense disputes over ownership, the people she had helped, and the promises she had once had to prove with patience and precision. All of it returned clearly in her thoughts. She had trained herself to evaluate everything with logic rather than emotion. But now she realized she could not look only at documents and legal authority. She had to feel life with her heart, and deep inside she felt that she had the right to live fully. When the phone suddenly rang, she startled slightly. Looking at the screen, she saw Daniel's name. This time, she did not hesitate. She knew the call was important. Margaret, Daniel's voice came through the phone, no longer as gentle as before, but filled with unmistakable firmness. I just received an update from my associate. Adam got the notice today, and he is clearly not happy about it. But I have to tell you, this is only the beginning. He will definitely push back. Mary remained silent for a few seconds. The feeling of worry rose again, but she refused to let it take control of her. I am prepared for that. I have spent my whole life trying to please others, but now I have to live for myself, Daniel. Do not worry, I will not step back. Daniel's voice softened slightly, yet it still carried concern. Good. I will send someone to deliver the next notice next week. You need to be patient and do not let emotions take over. Everything will be fine. Thank you, Daniel, Mary replied. But inside her, a powerful feeling was rising. This was not just a legal battle. It was also a battle for her to reclaim control over her own life, to reclaim the rights she had unknowingly given up for so many years. After ending the call, Mary felt a fresh sense of clarity. She could not change the past, but she could change the future, and she would do exactly that, no matter how many difficulties she might have to face. The following day, she received a message from Rachel. At first, she did not plan to respond immediately. A wave of tiredness came over her, but eventually she decided to open the message. Mom, I do not understand what is happening. Adam is very angry. Are you sure about what you are doing? If you do this, we could lose everything. Rachel wrote, the tone of the message filled with worry, as if her daughter truly could not understand why her mother would do such a thing. Mary looked at the message without rushing to reply. Part of her wanted to comfort Rachel, but another part of her knew she had to remain firm. She had lived far too long being gentle and constantly worrying about everyone else. It was time for that to end. After a moment, she began typing her response. Rachel, I am doing all of this because I love you, but also because I love myself. I have lived too long in silence and sacrifice. I cannot continue living that way anymore. I love you, but I cannot live your life for you. I hope one day you will understand. She sent the message and then looked at the phone, feeling both a strange emptiness and a sense of release. She did not know how Rachel would respond, but she understood that she could not continue worrying about that anymore. She had done what she needed to do. Now all that remained were the next steps. Everything would unfold in its own way. She had already begun her journey, and she had no intention of stopping. The next morning, when Mary woke up, the light of the early sun streamed into the room, chasing away the cold stillness left behind by the night before. It felt like the beginning of a new morning, a new start, yet the worries in her heart had not completely disappeared. She had chosen to leave, not out of fear, but out of awakening, a realization that her life could no longer continue drifting by in silence and endless sacrifice. Even so, she could not forget the hostility and contempt she had felt from Adam, the cold words he had spoken the night before. Every word had cut into her like a blade, yet those same wounds had opened a new path before her, a path she now had to walk in order to reclaim the authority and respect she had forgotten she deserved after so many years. She sat in the armchair in the hotel living room, the light from the window not quite strong enough to drive away the quiet heaviness inside her. Everything remained still, and once again she felt that she was standing at a major turning point in her life. It was the turning point of change, of reclaiming ownership not only in the legal sense, but also in the emotional sense. She was no longer the mother who endured everything in silence for the sake of family harmony, no longer the woman who stood quietly in the shadow of her husband and her children. This was the moment when she had to stand up, not only to protect the house, but to protect herself. A wave of anxiety rose within her, but she quickly pushed it aside. Worry would not help her now. She had to be strong, not only for herself, but also for her daughter. Everything had already been decided, and she would not turn back. She had spent her entire life working to preserve peace within the family, but now she understood that a family could not truly exist without respect and equality. Adam might try everything to overpower her, but she would not allow him to continue doing so. Suddenly, her phone rang, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was Rachel. She picked up the phone, slightly tense but determined to keep her voice calm. "Mom, he is very angry. He says we cannot do this. I do not understand why you have to do this." Rachel's voice trembled with worry. Every word felt like a blade cutting into Mary's heart, but she knew she could not allow herself to soften now. "Rachel, I am not doing this because I want to hurt you. I am doing this for myself and for your future. You cannot keep living in a relationship without respect and equality. I have lived in silence for far too long. Now it is time for me to stop." She paused for a moment, feeling the silence from Rachel's side of the phone. The quiet pained her, yet she also knew this was a truth her daughter had to face. She could not save Rachel by shielding her from reality. That was not love. It was a lesson she had learned through many years of experience. Rachel finally spoke again, her voice choked with emotion. "I know, Mom. I just do not know what to do. You need to move forward, Rachel. You need to live your own life. I will always be here, but I cannot continue helping you live in lies and fear. It is time for you to step outside on your own." Mary ended the call, her heart filled with conflicting emotions. The pain from the conversation with her daughter still lingered, but she would not allow herself to collapse under it. This was the path she had to take, no matter how difficult it might be. There was no other choice. She stood up and walked toward the window, looking outside. The world beyond remained calm, continuing just as it did every other day. But for her, everything had changed. A strange feeling, yet one filled with freedom, spread through her soul. She had taken back control, not only of the house, but also of her life. At this moment, she was no longer the woman who endured contempt, no longer the person who lived in silence and sacrifice. She was someone standing firmly on her own feet, ready to face any hardship in order to protect the things she cherished. Throughout her life, she had sacrificed and endured so much. But today, she had decided that nothing was more important than protecting herself. She could not live forever in the shadow of others. She had to step into the light and live the life she truly deserved. She looked at the mirror in the room, and for the first time in many years, she saw someone different. She was no longer a frail, exhausted old woman, but a strong person filled with determination. The wrinkles on her face were no longer signs of weariness, but proof of a life that had been fully lived, even if it had come at a cost. "It is time," she whispered to herself before gently turning back to the desk where the documents were still waiting. She would never allow anyone, not a single person, to take away her ownership again. The next step she would take would carry no hesitation and no fear, only determination. Mary was ready. This battle was not only about the house, it was about her life. She would protect everything she had built, and no one would be able to stop her. The next morning, Mary woke up feeling something that was not quite peace, yet no longer the heavy weight that had followed her during the previous days. The morning air from outside slipped gently through the window, fresh and cool, but she could not completely push away the truth that still lingered in her mind. Rachel knew everything now, and even though Mary had explained herself clearly, something still made her uneasy. Would her daughter truly understand the reason behind all of these decisions? Would Rachel be able to accept the truth and rebuild her own life, No longer depending on Adam, no longer remaining in a relationship filled with deception. She looked out the window as the sunlight slowly began to break through thick clouds. Everything in the city continued as usual. Yet for her, a deep transformation had already taken place. This was no longer only about ownership of the house. It was about her life, about the realization that she had spent too many years nurturing her family and trying to please everyone around her, while never truly protecting herself. Today was the day she would begin again, the day she would stand up not for anyone else, but for herself. Mary remembered the moment the night before when she sent the message to Rachel. The words might have sounded firmer than she originally intended, but they were necessary. It was time for her daughter to understand that she could no longer live within a lie, could no longer sacrifice everything for a family that no longer respected her. While Adam had grown increasingly rude and controlling, Rachel had remained silent, unable to speak up. For the first time, Mary realized she had to stand up for herself, to act for the sake of her own life. The feeling of anxiety had not disappeared, but she knew it was a sign of change. These worries were not there to stop her. They were reminders that the path she had chosen was not an easy one. Yet she also knew that difficulty would not defeat her. A woman who had spent an entire lifetime sacrificing for her family was now ready to walk forward for herself. Just then her phone rang. It was Rachel. Mary looked at the screen and hesitated briefly before answering. A quiet tension rose inside her because she did not know whether her daughter had truly accepted the truth yet. "Mom?" Rachel's voice came through the phone, sounding tired and fragile. "I do not understand. You said you cannot keep living like this anymore. But are you sure I will be okay?" Mary remained silent for a moment. The question was simple, yet it placed her in the middle of a difficult choice. She had always wanted to protect her daughter, always wanted Rachel to feel safe, but she understood now that protecting a child did not always mean doing everything for them. Sometimes it meant helping them discover their own strength and independence. "Rachel," Mary said softly, her voice calm but steady, "I cannot continue living in this constant sacrifice. I want you to have a life of your own, a life where you do not have to endure anyone, not even me. I have lived in silence for far too long, and now I need to live for myself." "I understand, Mom," Rachel replied, though her voice was still thick with emotion. "I know you want what is best for me, but I just do not know what to do anymore." Mary listened carefully before answering slowly, "You do not have to have all the answers right now, but you need to remember that you deserve a life that you choose for yourself. No one has the right to force you to live the way they want, especially Adam." A brief silence passed between them. Then Rachel spoke again. "I will find somewhere else to stay. I will not stay with him anymore. I will not go back, Mom." When Mary heard those words, she felt as if a heavy stone had finally been lifted from her shoulders. Her daughter had realized the truth. Rachel had made a decisive choice, the very thing Mary had hoped for over so many years. Yet she also understood that this decision would not be easy. Rachel would face many challenges ahead, but at least she would no longer live in fear or deception. "You are a strong person, Rachel. I believe you can do this," Mary said warmly, her voice filled with both encouragement and certainty. After the conversation ended, Mary felt a new sense of hope rising within her. No matter how furious Adam might become or how strongly he might resist, no matter how difficult things might get, she knew she had done the right thing. And now what mattered was not only reclaiming her house, but also opening a new path for both herself and her daughter. When she put the phone down, the sunlight outside the window had grown brighter, as if the world itself were witnessing the change she had just set in motion. The steps ahead would not be easy, but Mary was no longer afraid. She no longer saw darkness. All she could see was the light ahead, the light of freedom and authority that she had finally reclaimed for herself. She stepped out of the room with determination. Life would never be the same as before, but she was ready for whatever came next. Mary could not clearly remember how many times she had sat here, in this very house, quietly looking at the silent walls and the memories surrounding her. But today, as she returned, everything seemed different. The suffocating pressure that had followed her for so many years was gone. The walls that once felt confining, the walls she had called home even though they had never truly belonged to her, no longer held that weight. Today, this house belonged to her not only in a legal sense, but also in her heart, a place where she could finally rediscover herself without worrying about anyone else's control. She stood in front of the gate with the key in her hand as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the road. The house still looked the same, yet it felt completely different. It was no longer a place burdened by the presence of people who had once taken control of her life. Everything now was hers. A strange sense of lightness filled her chest, yet at the same time it felt unfamiliar, as if she had never truly stepped into this house during all those years. When she opened the door and walked inside, the air felt different. There was no television noise filling the room, no tension hidden behind Adam's rude remarks, no more waiting anxiously to see what someone else would do next. The space was quiet, but the silence carried a sense of freedom she had never known before. It was not the silence of fear, but the silence of peace and ownership. She slowly walked further inside, feeling the change with every step. The walls were still there, yet they no longer felt cold or suffocating. She began gathering the things Adam had left behind, the unnecessary items that had never truly belonged to her. The sofa that Adam had occupied for so many years, the table, the chairs, all of them had once symbolized the control and domination she had endured. Now they were simply lifeless objects with no meaning. She opened the windows and allowed fresh air to flow into the house, sweeping away the stale breath that had lingered for so long. She could hear the wind rustling through the garden outside, and the distant sound of birds singing, as if the world beyond these walls had always continued moving forward without stopping. Each of her footsteps seemed to erase the traces of the past. The feeling was almost magical. It had been a long time since she had felt this kind of power within herself. When she stepped into the living room, the space Adam had once dominated, she did not feel anger. Instead, she felt calm. Her old armchair, the chair where she had spent countless lonely hours, now carried a different meaning. It was no longer just a meaningless seat in the corner of the house. It had become a symbol of her return, of ownership, of reclaiming who she truly was. She took out her old apron, grabbed a mop, and began cleaning. The feeling was strange, almost as if she were starting life again from the beginning, clearing away not only the dust in the house, but also the weight that had lived inside her for years. The old carpets and the hidden corners of the house no longer made her uneasy. They were just objects, and now they could no longer hide or contain her emotions. Everything was finally clear. While cleaning, she paused to look at the photographs hanging on the walls. Old family pictures, memories of her daughter, moments she had devoted to this family, even though they had not always been appreciated. She could still feel the sweetness within those memories, but the pain was no longer there. That belonged to the past, and the past needed to remain behind her. She began thinking about what would come next. The house needed repairs, it needed renewal. She wanted to change not only the furniture, but the entire space. She wanted this place to become somewhere she could truly live freely and peacefully. This would be her home, a home no longer shadowed by people who had never respected her. After several hours of cleaning, she stopped and looked around the room. Fresh air filled the space, and warm sunlight streamed gently through the windows. This house was no longer a place where she had to hide in the shadows. It would now be the place where she lived her own life without restraint. This was not a victory in the ordinary sense, but a victory within her heart. She had found herself again. And as she stood there looking at the house, she realized this had never been just about a physical building. It was about power, about reclaiming her life, about freedom. And she knew she would protect that freedom no matter what. Mary stood by the window, her hand resting on the cold window frame, her eyes looking outside. The scene out there was the same as every other day, the city still busy with its hurried rhythm of life. But for her, everything had changed. There was no longer the feeling of anxiety, no longer the sense of helplessness or fear like before. This house was no longer a place that held painful memories and suppressed emotions. Now it had become a completely new space, a place where she could rediscover herself and begin again. She could not deny that after everything she had been through, a small sense of worry still lingered inside her. Would things truly unfold the way she hoped? Would Adam and Rachel really accept her decision? Or would everything become even more complicated? Each question felt like a small cut, yet Mary had learned to accept fear instead of letting it control her. Her whole life she had lived for others, ignoring her own feelings and needs. But now she knew that the time had come to live for herself. Over the past few days, she had received many calls from Daniel, her old friend in the legal field. He always kept her spirit steady, reminding her that everything had been clearly planned. And she had decided that no matter how difficult things might become, she would not step back. She had begun a journey to reclaim ownership of her home, not only through legal documents, but through her own courage and determination. This morning, she received a call from Rachel. When she saw her daughter's name appear on the phone screen, a wave of anxiety rose inside her. After all, Rachel was still her daughter, the one she had spent her entire life loving and raising. Rachel had heard about the legal notice Mary had sent. Mary knew that Rachel would certainly not be happy, but she could no longer live in hesitation. It was time to face the truth. "Mom?" Rachel's voice came through the phone, slightly choked, as if she had been trying to hold back her emotions. "Are you sure we can't solve this another way?" Mary looked at the phone, sighed softly, and pressed the answer button. When she spoke, her voice was firm yet gentle. "Rachel, I thought about this for a long time before making this decision. I don't want to hurt you, but I can't spend the rest of my life sacrificing myself for others. I need to live for myself." "I know," Rachel replied, her voice softer now but still carrying exhaustion. "I just don't want everything to become more complicated. I'm afraid you'll lose the family." "I'm afraid too," Mary said, her eyes looking into the distance where warm sunlight was shining down like a sign of a new day. "But sometimes family is not something we keep by sacrificing everything. Family is when we respect and love each other, not when we live inside lies." A long silence stretched between the two of them. Mary could feel the pain in Rachel's voice, yet she also knew this was the only path that would allow both of them to live honestly with themselves. Finally, Rachel spoke. "I won't go back to Adam, Mom. I'm going to find a new place to live." Rachel's words were like a beam of light shining into the darkness inside Mary's heart. Although it was not exactly the outcome she had expected, at least Rachel had decided to stand up, not just for her mother, but for her own life. Mary felt a sense of relief because at least her daughter had begun to realize that she had the right to decide her own life. "You are a strong woman, Rachel. I know you can do it," Mary said, her voice filled with pride. "You will find your own path, and I will always be here supporting you." The conversation ended, and Mary felt a heavy burden lift from her shoulders. Still, she knew her journey was far from over. The house was still there, but she could not return to the past. What she needed to do now was continue moving forward, not only for herself, but also for her daughter, and for everything she had learned throughout all those years. That entire day, Mary spent cleaning the house, arranging everything the way she wanted. Objects and belongings that she had never dared to change before were now placed exactly where she felt most comfortable. The house was no longer just a place to live. It was the place where she rediscovered herself, a space that truly belonged to her and was no longer controlled by anyone else. When the cleaning was finished, she looked around and felt a quiet sense of joy, not the feeling of victory, but the feeling of peace. This house had truly become hers. No one could control it or take it away anymore. She had not only reclaimed the house, she had reclaimed her right to live her own life. She sat down in the armchair and looked around once more. The room felt completely different now. It was no longer a place filled with heaviness, but a place of freedom and peace. This was the true beginning of a new chapter. The feeling was extraordinary, as if she had finally taken full control of her life, and from now on she would continue living the way she wanted, without fear and without worry about anything anymore. Mary sat at the dining table in her home, gently turning the teacup on the table with her hand. The gentle aroma of tea spread softly through the quiet space. It had been a very long time since she had been able to enjoy a morning like this, without rushing, without anxiety, only the peace she had longed for during so many years. Everything in the house had been rearranged, every item placed exactly where it belonged. The spaces that once felt occupied now truly belonged to her. There was no noise, no arguments, only the calm stillness of a place returned to its rightful owner. She looked around, and every detail in the house made her feel as if she had stepped into a new life. The walls were no longer cold and distant. They were witnesses to the moments she had built over so many years. The chairs, the tables, even the curtains she had carefully chosen years ago, all carried her mark. They were not merely objects. They were memories, stories that had been written within this house. And now she could live in this space without worrying about anyone else taking control of it. She remembered the days when Adam and Rachel still lived with her. The feeling that her ownership had been invaded made her feel as though she was no longer herself. Rachel's silence, Adam's indifference, all of it slowly pushed her into a corner where she could no longer feel respect or love. But now the house was no longer a place of those feelings. It was a place where she could live as herself, do what she wished without worrying about what anyone would do or say. The feeling was strange, but also sweet. She had lived far too long in sacrifice, in promises she could never truly fulfill. She had traded away too many things, from her personal rights to dreams that had quietly faded away. But now she no longer had to trade anything. This was the moment she would live for herself, the moment she would no longer bow her head and accept what she did not deserve. Yet she could not deny that the decision had not been easy. It had taken her a long time to understand that one cannot live forever in unconditional sacrifice. Even after she chose to move forward, there were still moments when she doubted herself and worried about the future. The long nights in the hotel, the conversations with Daniel, all of it made her feel as though she had been standing at the edge of change. But in the moment she realized that this house was hers, that she had the right to control it and her own life, all that worry seemed to fade away. She looked at her phone, and once again Rachel was calling. This time, she did not feel anxious. It was time to face whatever remained. This call was no longer only about the house. It was about how she would help her daughter step out and stand on her own. "Mom," Rachel said, her voice sounding lighter than before, "I found a place to stay. I'm not going back to Adam anymore." Mary smiled, and inside her heart a wave of pride rose quietly. Her daughter had decided to stand up, to take control of her own life. That was exactly what Mary had always wanted Rachel to understand, that she did not need to rely on anyone, that she did not have to live in fear or silence. "You are strong, Rachel. I'm very proud of you," Mary replied, her voice filled with emotion. "You will find your path. I truly believe that." A sense of release filled her heart, not because Adam had left, and not only because she had regained ownership of the house, but because she had helped her daughter realize that she deserved a life that was free and independent. She also realized that throughout so many years, she had done everything for her family, but in the end, she had to live for herself first. And her daughter had done something Mary herself had never dared to do: step away from control and find her own path. Mary did not know what would happen next, but she no longer felt anxious or uneasy. She did not have to fear that the house would be taken from her again, or that she would have to live under pressure anymore. All of that was over. And now she would begin a new chapter of her life, not only with the house, but with herself. Everything was no longer a battle for ownership. It was a journey of living truthfully as who she really was. She stood up and walked through the rooms of the house, feeling every corner she had made her own. There was no rush, no worry, only peace. And she knew that no matter how many challenges might come ahead, she would overcome them all, because she had finally found herself again. Today, Mary woke up not with anxiety or a sense of waiting, but with a strange and gentle calm. The morning light streamed through the window, casting soft rays onto the small table where she sat, a warm cup of tea resting in her hands. This house, the house she had lived in for almost her entire life, had finally become a place where she felt peace. There were no more arguments, no more harsh words, no more control from anyone else. Everything had changed, and at last she could breathe freely. As she looked around, everything still appeared the same. The old walls, the chair she had sat in every day, the dining table where the family once gathered together, they were all still there, yet something invisible had changed. It was the feeling of freedom. This house was no longer a place that held her captive in silence and sacrifice. It was no longer a space filled with conflict and deception. It had become a place where she could live freely without being controlled by anyone. Over the past few days, as she began cleaning and rearranging the house, she realized she was not only rebuilding the physical space, she was also rebuilding her own life. Everything in the house carried her imprint, from the small objects she loved to the memories that had been buried for so many years. Every step she took through the rooms felt like reclaiming ownership again, not just of the house, but of herself. Mary sat down in the familiar armchair and looked out the window. The quietness in the room was something she had not felt for many years. All her life she had sacrificed. She had lived for her family, but now she understood that sacrifice could not last forever. Her children had grown up, and now she had to live for herself. Her eyes lifted toward the deep blue sky, and she felt a peace she had never known before. Suddenly her phone rang, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was Rachel. She pressed the answer button without hesitation. She had once worried about how her daughter would react, but now she felt calm. She no longer needed to be afraid. "Mom," Rachel's voice came through the phone, no longer tired, no longer filled with worry like before. "I found a place to stay. I'm not going back to Adam anymore." Mary smiled softly. At last, her daughter had decided to stand up for herself. Rachel was no longer living under Adam's control, no longer allowing herself to be manipulated by lies. She had found her own path. Mary knew that even if Rachel had to face new challenges ahead, she would not be afraid anymore. That was all Mary had ever wished for, that her daughter could live independently without relying on anyone. "You are very strong, Rachel," Mary said, her voice full of pride. "I'm very proud of you. You will find your way. I truly believe that." Mary placed the phone down and felt as if the whole world around her was shifting. It was not a material change, but a change within the soul. Her daughter had realized that she deserved a life of her own, and Mary herself was no longer the person standing behind everyone else, sacrificing everything. She had opened the door for Rachel to discover herself. It was something Mary had never dared to do for her own life before. She turned and looked around the house again, at the walls, the objects, and the memories she had carried for so many years. Now none of them felt like pressure or fear. She had truly taken back control of her life. The feeling was unfamiliar, yet incredibly freeing. She was no longer afraid, no longer worried about things that were never truly hers to carry. She no longer had to live in compromise. As she continued moving through the house, arranging and organizing things, she realized it was not only the house that needed rebuilding. She herself needed to rebuild her life from the beginning. The things she had pushed aside for so many years were slowly returning. The dreams that had never been fulfilled, the hopes that had been forgotten, all of them could still be rebuilt. Finally, she paused in the middle of the room, looking at the cleaned walls and the newly arranged belongings, and she quietly asked herself, what matters most now? She did not need an answer right away, because she had come to understand that not everything must be solved immediately. Sometimes, simply having a quiet space to feel, to reconnect with oneself, is enough. Mary sat down again, her eyes resting on the view outside the window. The last rays of sunlight touched her face, like a reminder of change, of a new life. She was no longer the exhausted and worn woman she had been in the past. She was a strong woman, a free woman, ready to move forward. And now she could live her life without worrying about what anyone else might do. That was the freedom she had been searching for all along. She had taken back her home, and more importantly, she had found herself again. So Mary has finally reclaimed her power, taking back her home not only in a physical sense, but also in spirit. This is a story about resilience, about the truth that it is never too late to change, and most importantly, about freedom. If you feel like you are living in the shadows or sacrificing too much for others while forgetting about yourself, remember that you have the right to stand up, to rediscover your voice and the space that belongs to you. If this story has inspired you, do not hesitate to share it with the people around you. Let them know that they too can change their lives, just as Mary did. Do not forget to press like, subscribe, and leave a comment below this video so we can continue sharing more stories and lessons about strength, freedom, and transformation. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next stories.